Hello, welcome to the sixth lecture of this cycle. This evening we will start to deal with the age of the Lombard domination from 568 to 774. During these 2 centuries, Italy reached the lowest points of a decadence that had started with the crisis of the Roman Empire at the end of the 3rd century. After the Lombard Conquest and after the consolidation of the Lombard kingdom, a very slow recovery will begin. Italy will face many other difficult periods, but will never find itself into a situation as hopeless as in the last quarter of the 6th century. We will need more than this lecture to deal with the 2 centuries of the Lombard domination. One of the reasons for that is that there were 4 different forces active in Italy over this period. The Lombards played the main role, of course, but there was also the Byzantine Exarchate to be reckoned with. Then there was the Roman Church, and last but not least, the Franks, whose incursions and influence increasingly conditioned the situation in Italy. We have already dealt with the Byzantines in the last lecture. Their presence will continue to shrink under the Lombards' pressure. We will deal with the Franks in the near future. In this lecture and in the next, we shall focus on the other 2 forces that shaped those 2 centuries. Let us start with the Lombards, who gave their name to the central region of northern Italy, the largest and most populous among Italian regions. We have already mentioned the Lombards in the first lecture of this cycle. Their name is a shortening of the Latin word Langobardi, which is a translation from a Germanic term. The people with the long beards, in ancient German Langbärte, had not always had this name. The ancestral home of the Winili had been the region of Scania in the south of Sweden. In the 1st century BC, following an overpopulation crisis, they had started a long migration which had led them initially to the island of Rügen in front of the Baltic coast of Germany. There they had defeated the Vandals, who had left Sweden before them. A Lombard legend made this victory coincide with their people name change, allegedly related to the cult of Wotan, which the Lombard probably embraced in the first stage of their migration. From Rügen, they moved to the German mainland, first to western Mecklenburg, and then deeper inland into the Lüneburger Heath in what is now Lower Saxony. Then they proceeded further south, always fighting hostile tribes along the way. They approximately followed the course of the Elbe, where they clashed with the troops of Tiberius at the beginning of the 1st century AD. They penetrated into Bohemia and Moravia, and finally into the Roman province of Pannonia, and more exactly into Lower Austria. There the Lombards settled for decades. Troublesome neighbors of the Eastern Roman Empire, which had used some of their troops in the Gothic War in Italy, where the Lombard auxiliaries gained a reputation of extreme brutality. Procopius reports that the first concern of General Narses after winning the war had been to ensure that these 5,000 Lombards allied left Italy as soon as possible. 15 years later, however, it was maybe the incumbent vicinity of the Avars, together with the narrations of the Gothic War veterans, that induced the Lombards to invade Italy. In the year 568, led by their king Alboin, they crossed the Julian Alps and enter into the vast North Italian plain. Who were these people? We are probably talking about 100, 200,000 people, an entire society traveling with carts and animals and preceded by scouting troops. The Lombards were organized in fare, social units which have left many Italian toponyms and on which historians have debated for a long time. The Fara was probably a large association of clans in march. There is an echo in the German verb fahren, meaning to travel on vehicles. It comprised warriors, their families, their slaves, and members of the community who could not carry weapons. The tasks of the Phara range from fighting and plundering to the procurement of accommodations for people and animals. It was a social structure suited for a nation on the move, who had fought its way through from Scandinavia through the Mediterranean. It proved its effectiveness in the conquest of Italy, where it served both as mobile fighting unit and as an occupation force. The first important city to be taken by the invaders was called Forum Iuli, nowadays Cividale del Friuli. It would become an important Lombard settlement and leave its Latin name to a whole region of Italy, Friuli. Then several other cities fell: Aquileia, Vicenza, Verona. The Byzantine Empire was unable to react, weakened by the financial crisis triggered by the wars of Justinian, and by then mainly focused on the incumbent threat of the Sasanian Empire. The contemporaries failed to grasp the extent of the empire crisis and could not understand its inability to put up any resistance to the Lombards' advance. This generated a conspiracy theory that the invasion had been a revenge of Narses, recalled to Byzantium in 567, and people imagined that he might have invited the Lombards before leaving, or that he had revealed to them how to overcome Italy's defenses. Anyway, in 569 the Lombards took Milan and besieged Pavia, which fell 3 years later. In the meantime, Lombard armies occupied Tuscany. Other groups reached the center and the south of Italy, where they founded the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento, which would then last even longer than the Lombard kingdom itself. Other Lombard expeditions reached the south of France. Maybe Italy could have been for the Lombards only a place of transit if they could exited, if they would have been able to pour into France, but the obstacle posed by the Frankish kingdoms prevented them from moving further west. Therefore, they settled in Italy, unfortunate, and divided among themselves. The reign of Alboin, a strictly warlike figure, was short. Only 3 years after the invasion, he was murdered in his bedroom by his foster brothers with the complicity of the king's wife, Rosamond. She had not forgiven Alboin, who, during a banquet in which everyone had drunk a lot, had said to his stablemates that Rosamond should as well have joined the toast together with her father. Rosamond was the daughter of the king of the Gepids, whom Alboin had defeated a few years before and then killed. His presence on that occasion was limited to his skull cap, out of which a goblet had been made. Of Alboin's successor, Clef, we only know what another Lombard wrote about 200 years later, i.e. that he killed and exiled many Romans. He was also murdered, this time by one of his own guards. His demise did not end that period of terror. The decade from 574 to 584 is known as the rule of the dukes, because the dukes remained without a king and they looted Italy without restraint, killing the very last survivors of the local aristocracy. Who were those dukes? Their name comes, of course, from the Latin word duces or duces in the classical Latin pronunciation. They were military commanders. Already in the 1st century AD, Tacitus had explained the distinction between kings and dukes in ancient German tribe. Reges ex nobilitate, duces ex virtutes sumunt. They chose their kings for the nobility of the blood and their dukes for their valor. The dukes were essentially military chiefs who led the fare as the divisions of an army. Paul the Deacon described the appointment of one of those dukes. When Alboin wished to secure a possible retreat before proceeding further deeply into the North Italian plain, he told Gisulf, one of his shield-bearers, to occupy the walled town of Forum Iuli. Gisulf requested the right to select a few fare for the settlement, and Alboin appointed him as a duke. But if the appointment of a duke could be done fairly quickly, The demotion was a different thing. It needed a war or an assassination. Therefore, the conflict between the Lombard kings and some of their dukes will remain a constant of Lombard history. By their settlement in Italy, the dukes reinforced their military, administrative, and judicial powers. Those powers knew no boundaries. The dukes normally required 1/3 of the local agricultural production from the local people. And once they settled in a city, the situation did not improve. They terrified the cities and the surrounding territories because they had to respond to the pressure of their warriors, who were only interested in looting and in planning new raids. The word of the early Middle Age was a zero-sum one, in the sense that almost any wealth acquired by someone had been taken from someone else. The population of Italy had not much room for negotiation with those people. The society of the Lombards was essentially one of warriors. The most important institution for them was the assembly of the free men, i.e., of those allowed to carry weapons. The Lombards called it the Gairethings, the gathering of the spears, because they regarded their own people as an army. The Gairethings selected the kings and approved changes in the laws. The laws were based on customs, and the kings could not alter them substantially unless they had submitted the changes to this assembly of warriors. It was this assembly who approved the first written laws of the Lombards in the year 643, not less than 75 years after the invasion. It would be probably wrong to imagine the Gairethings like a modern assembly where everyone has the right to speak. It was probably dominated by the dukes and the chiefs of the clans. This was probably the darkest period in the history of Italy, even worse than that of the Gothic-Byzantine War. For the first time in its millenarian history, the peninsula had fallen almost entirely under the domination of rulers who had not received the slightest appearance of an imperial legitimation, nor had any connection with Italy's past. Unlike the Ostrogoths, the Lombards showed no respect for the Roman tradition, nor for religious institutions. They were still mainly pagans, although part of their aristocracy had converted to Arian Christianism before the invasion. They plundered and killed indiscriminately the Catholic clergy and the last representative of the Latin upper classes. Even Paul the Deacon, the Lombard historian who wished to leave a positive memory of his people, admitted that the Italian population was nearly exterminated during the first decades of the Lombard domination. We understand from him and from other sources that the Lombards had a strong sense of identity as people, guarded by a firm attachment to their traditions. This must have been a consequence of the absence of written laws and of the strong parental ties of the Germanic family, already described by Tacitus many centuries before. For instance, a Lombard had to be able to name 7 generations on the parental line in order to be eligible for inheritance. This is, of course, something that people are not able to do nowadays, although many have known well their grandparents and can rely on written records. The other side of this strong sense of national identity was that the Lombards probably regarded other people as inferior. For instance, they denied to about 20,000 Saxons who had joined them in the invasion of Italy the right to live according to their own institutions. So we can easily imagine which consideration the Lombards gave to the rights of the locals. Eventually, in 584, the dukes, concerned by the increasing threat of the aggressive Franks, decided to elect a new king, to whom each duke gave half of his wealth. They chose Authari, son of Clef. He took the title of Flavius, as Odoacer and Theodoric had done, in order to establish a grotesque parallel with the dynasty of Roman emperors of the 1st century AD. The oppression of the population of Italy did not decrease. The appropriation of Italian goods and lands became more systematic and final. Nevertheless, authority achieved to transform bands of raiders into a draft of state. He did this within a short time and under difficult circumstances. He repelled 2 Frank invasions, beat a rebel duke who had become an ally of the Exarchate, and took some territory from the Byzantines. In 589, he married the daughter of the Duke of Bavaria, Theodelinda, who would become an important figure in Lombard history. When, on the following year, Authry suddenly died, Theodelinda was allowed to select a new spouse, i.e., a new king among the dukes. She chose Agilulf, the Duke of Turin. King Ego, as the Lombards familiarly call Agilulf, continued to pursue the formation of a state. This implied defeating rebel dukes and containing the pressure of the Franks on the west and on the Avars on the east, and on the Exarchate in the south of his kingdom. Agilulf succeeded on all that by ensuring peace with the Franks and the Avars, and by taking or retaking Byzantine territories, among which the cities of Padua, Cremona, and Mantua. He significantly strengthened the kingdom, which had Milan as its capital, together with the summer residence of Monza. Agilulf proclaimed himself Gratia Dei Rex Totius Italiae, by the grace of God, king of the whole Italy. It was an aspiration rather than a reality, but it still meant bringing the people of the peninsula under a single state, an idea that became a reality only 13 centuries later. Furthermore, in 616, Agilulf died in his bed, an uncommon way to live for a Lombard king, and he left the majority of the Lombards and most of the Italian population under a fairly consolidated kingdom, which the Byzantine had no longer any hope to overturn. The Exarchate of Italy still controlled the area between Bologna and Ravenna and the Adriatic coast down to Ancona. That situation is still apparent in the current name of the Italian regions, from Lombardy, the land of the Lombards, to Romagna, in today's Italian Romagna, i.e. the land of the Romans, as the Byzantines called themselves. The area around Ravenna was one of the Byzantine military districts. A second district, known as the Pentapolis, was immediately south on the Adriatic coast between Rimini and Ancona. These 2 districts were connected through a corridor across the Apennines, which included Perugia, to the area of Rome, another of the Byzantine territories. Furthermore, the Italian Exarchate controlled Venice, Naples, and the regions of the south they call Apulia and Calabria. The islands of Sicily and Sardinia were also under Byzantine control. They belonged to the Exarchate of Africa. The territories of the Eastern Roman Empire in Italy will gradually shrink during the 2 centuries of the Lombard domination, but this erosion took a long time. Within the Byzantine territories, Rome and the surrounding area was in a special situation because of the presence of the Pope. The age of the Lombard Conquest was somewhat brightened by the figure of Pope Gregory I, the only pope to be called the Great in the church history after Pope Leo I, who had saved Rome from Attila's hordes 1 century before. Gregory would have an enormous influence on the Middle Ages, maybe even more than St. Augustine. Gregory was born around the year 540 in an important Roman family which had included other popes. Gregory was his real first name. He had a good cultural formation, evident from his religious works and by the many letters written during his pontificate. Around the year 573, he had covered the very important office of Prefectus urbis, for the city of Rome, which he then left for the monastic life after he had converted into a monastery the palace of his ancestors in Rome. A few years later, however, Pope Pelagius II sent him as ambassador or apocrisiarius to Constantinople, where Gregory gained a knowledge of the Eastern Empire, which would later turn useful to him. There he also started his most ambitious theological work, a long commentary on the Book of Job, on which he worked for many years. Recalled in Rome in 587, Gregory returned to his monastery, where he remained until 590, when the Pope fell victim to the plague, and Gregory was called by acclamation to take his place in a very difficult situation. Italy had been already for more than 2 decades under the heel of the Lombards. They represented for Rome a triple threat, because their domain consisted of 3 independent states, the kingdom of Agilulf and the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento, both of them very close to Rome. The Lombards were mainly pagans, and the Pope had no influence on them. They were also keen to conquer Rome, connected to the other Byzantine territories only by a thin defense line. Very difficult were also the relationship with the empire, to which the territory of Rome still belonged, governed by an exarch with complete military and civil powers living in Ravenna. Gregory would face difficult crises with the Byzantines. Later on, he would have to deal with the first violent regime change ever occurred in the Eastern Empire. In 602, an army revolted against Emperor Maurice, the last descendant of Justinian dynasty. Maurice fled Constantinople, and a rebellious general, Phocas, was proclaimed emperor. The replacement was not a model of fair play. Phocas had Maurice dragged from the monastery where he had sought refuge and killed him after forcing him to witness the execution of his 6 sons. Yet Gregory managed to establish a good relationship with this monster, who would confirm on many occasions his cruelty. Apart from the extreme dangers represented by the Lombards and the Byzantine, Gregorius had to deal with other difficult issues. In the 6th century, the authority of the Pope on the Christian ecumeny was not like that of today. His direct sphere of influence were the former western provinces of the empire, including Spain, Gaul, and Italy. There were 4 patriarchs with a comparable authority, that of Constantinople, that of Antiochia, that of Jerusalem, and that of Alexandria. The Pope and the patriarchs were supposed to agree on important questions, while the emperor considered himself to be above all of them, as we saw in the previous lecture. The bishops in Spain and Gaul had in practice little contact with the Pope. In Italy, the Catholic Church was still suffering from the schism of the 3 chapters, by which, in 553, the bishops of several Italian regions had left the church, led by the Bishop of Aquileia, who had proclaimed himself a patriarch. Therefore, counting also the followers of Arianism, there were 3 Christian churches in Italy at the time. Even in Rome, Gregory could only count on himself. The senatorial aristocracy of Theoderic's time did not exist anymore. The Gothic Byzantine War had wiped it out. Because of the terror spread by the Lombards in Italy, Rome was full of refugees who lived in the streets. After decades of war, famines, and epidemics, the end of the world looked imminent to the starving population. The homilies of Gregory give an idea of the appalling conditions of the time. In this bleak framework, the Pope had only 2 resources: the wealth that the Church had gathered over time thanks to the substantial donations of the believers, and the prestige that the Pope enjoyed for being the successor of St. Peter in the same city where the first of the apostles had received his martyrdom. They would have been useless without the political intelligence and the moral authority of Gregory himself. For what concerns the prestige due to the Rolle, it could have vanished if the new pope had been inadequate to it. Only a few decades earlier, Pope Vigil had become a target for the stones and insults of the Roman plebs when on his way to the ship for Constantinople. For what concerns the church's economic resources, Gregory organized them for the charitable relief to the poor. He liquidated church properties to feed the alms and organized the revenue-generating farmland of the church so that it could ship substantial quantities of food to the starving population of Rome. He divided the Sicilian latifundia and distributed lands to shepherds, helping them to become farmers. He was an admirable administrator whom John the Deacon would compare to Argos, the giant with 100 eyes. With an act of transparency exceptional for those times, Gregory imposed that every farmer received a booklet with the indication of the tributes to which he was obliged, in order that no one could require anything else from him. He forbade that the church could, under any circumstances, succeed in the rights of the legitimate heirs of tenant farmers, and even force a monastery to return a bequest to the legitimate heirs of the deceased, in his effort to communicate that the church should never be associated with the idea of greed. He relentlessly urges churchmen to give the highest priority to the poor, and gave the example in Rome, where he organized distributions of food to people and a daily relief system for those living in the streets. The rumor spread that every day the Pope refused to eat until the last indigent had been fed. The people of Rome turned to the Pope for the government of the city and forgot the Byzantines. There's no time to resume the prodigious activity of this man of shaky health who had longed for the peace of the monastic life. His political action is documented in his 854 letters, an extraordinary document of the time and of the personality of the Pope. Then he was the author of a regula pastoralis, containing guidelines for bishops and priests. Then we have the 4 books of the dialogues, popular during the Middle Ages, in which Gregory narrates in form of dialogue the lives of Italian saints. Their style is plain and clear. The narration gives an idea of a positive personality in those times of ruin and despair. Gregory also wrote 22 homilies on Ezekiel and 40 homilies on the Gospels. He was the author of works on the Old Testament, and especially of the Moralia in Job, a very long commentary to the book of Job. This book must have had for Gregory a special meaning, perhaps because he had already twice tried to follow his monastic vocation, only to be recalled into the secular world and be charged with the heaviest burden of tasks and responsibilities. He was also the author of a missal and of a collection of chants. The style of Gregory is sometimes plain and direct, as in the dialogues, and sometimes solemn and official, depending on the occasions. In both cases, we are frequently able to read emotions behind the words. Gregory's prolific writing was in any case largely exceeded by his indefatigable political and administrative activity, which stretched from the relief to the poor, to the protection of the independence of monasteries, to the mitigation of Byzantine exaction, to thwarting the threats of the Lombards, and to a new wave of missionary activity. He sent Augustine of Canterbury, the prior of the monastery that Gregory had founded in his own palace, to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons, as we know from Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. The diligence of Gregory in carrying out his mission was assisted by political vision and pragmatism. This is why he succeeded in tasks which seemed hopeless. When he ascended to the Holy See, Gregory had seen the worst of the Lombards. Their contracts are the swords, he wrote, and their friendship is a punishment of God. In the dialogues written around 594, Gregory describes the situation in Italy when he refers of someone to the dream of someone in which a martyr had appeared announcing the end of the world. Gregory adds, terrible signs in the sky followed that vision. Towards the north, spears and armies of fire appear, and shortly after that, the cruel people of the Lombards, drawn from their dwellings, rage upon us, and our people, who used to be numerous and dense like wheat, has been exterminated. Their cities have been plundered, the forts demolished, the church burns, the monasteries for monks and nuns destroyed as well. The fields have been emptied of those who used to attend them, the countryside made a desert. No one lives there anymore, and wild beasts have taken the place of people. I don't know what happens elsewhere, but in this land where we live, the word does not simply announce. It shows already in all evidence its forthcoming end, wrote Gregory. Even towards the end of its pontificate in the year 602, Gregory couldn't suppress the following exclamation. How many daily massacres, how many incursions of the Lombards haven't we seen over these last 35 long years? He didn't lack direct experience. He had managed twice to avoid a direct assault of the Lombards on Rome, first by the Duke of Spoleto, then by King Agilulf in 593. He did that by paying huge sums to the aggressors. In order to do that, he dealt with Agilulf as he had the power to negotiate, a power that nobody had granted him. He irritated the emperor, but he saved Rome and assumed de facto a role of defender of the Italian population. In spite of that, he never, in spite of his attitude, he never stiffened into a sterile hostility towards the Lombards. To the contrary, he urged the bishops to look for ways of dealing with them. Furthermore, he understood the change that was taking place within the Lombard society, the progressive strengthening of the power of the kings. He held a correspondence with Theodelinda, and this relationship with the royal family was fruitful to the point that the son of Theodelinda and Agilulf was baptized in the year 603. It was an astonishing change. Only a dozen years earlier, the first husband of Theodelinda, Authry, had forbidden the Catholic baptism of the Lombard people. The wise approach of the Pope obtained more than one could have reasonably hoped. The return of the Catholic bishops to the cities that they had fled many years before, the restitution of many of the church properties, even the foundation of new churches and monasteries in the territories under Lombard control. Not only Agilulf, who was Arian, didn't persecute Catholics, but he even supported the foundation of the monastery of Bobbio by Saint Columba, who had come from Ireland to propagate the Catholic faith. The Arian king of the 7th century kept the same attitude of religious tolerance that had been of Agilulf. With the time, all the cities of the Lombard kingdom had a Catholic bishop beside an Arian one, while the adherents of the three-chapter schism kept decreasing over time. Furthermore, in the year 598-99, Gregory had managed to negotiate a truce between the Lombard and the Byzantine. This was occasionally broken and renewed, but overall it held until the death of Agilulf in 616. King Ego, who had enjoyed the support of his people, left to his still adolescent son Adaloald a consolidated kingdom, upon which Theodelinda exercised the regency. Adaloald lasted until the year 626, when he was deposed. His mother Theodelinda died on the following year. The new king, Arioald, was Arian, but tolerant with Catholics as well. In 636 he was replaced by Rothari, a strong king, but again tolerant on religious matters. The Catholic faith had been spreading in the meantime, and this gradually made the life under the Lombard domain somewhat easier. These were the long-term fruits of Gregory's pragmatism and vision. As for Gregory himself, he had died already in 604. He had left a gap that could not be filled. Thanks to his dedication to the mitigation of the suffering of the people, he had become the defender of the population of Italy. He was declared a saint by popular acclaim immediately after his death. He is a saint also for the Orthodox Church and for the Anglicans. His pontificate had associated in the minds of people the hope that political power could coexist with the ideals of Christianity, an idea that held during the Middle Ages and beyond, in spite of the many very bad popes that came after Gregory. To the people of Rome, he had also made a secular government redundant, a concept that will held until the 19th century. But we will deal with the subject in other lectures of this cycle. In the next lecture, we will deepen our analysis of Italy under the Lombards. In the meantime, have a nice evening and see you soon.